All right, so my name is Stephan Kreutzer. I'm a principal consultant with the Technopolis Group based in Berlin. And I have a background in political science and international political economy, which I studied both in Germany and the UK. I like about my job that it's quite varied because on average I work on between 5 to 8 projects at the same time. Some of them are more focused on local political issues or national political issues in Germany. Others are very international, mostly on the European level, but also some extending to South Asia and Africa in terms of the geographic focus of the work. I think the flip side of this variety is that you don't always have the time to really dig deep into a specific subject matter. You're more, not necessarily generalist, you can build up expertise, but you will always meet people who know more about the subject you're currently dealing with than you do, because that's all they spend their time studying or working on. Whereas as a consultant, you usually work on many topics at the same time. So that's something I notice sometimes, which is something you just have to be aware of if you want to work in this field. So this is the third job, actually, the third full-time job I have, and the previous 2 companies were also working in a similar, in the same sector essentially, with a slightly different focus. So I've basically been doing public policy consulting for the last 10 years. I've got into my first job through an internship, which I found out about via an internship fair that was organized at my university where I studied at the time. And then from then on, I built up relationships, made contacts in the sector, and through that, I moved on to the company that I'm with right now. When I first started out with this internship, it was also slightly coincidental. It was just at the time something I wanted to try out, but I wasn't quite sure, and it was not something that I had really been planning to do after I finished my studies, to become a public policy consultant. But then I took a bit of a gap between my first and second job, where I tried out a few different things because I wasn't quite sure if this is really for me. And then these other things either didn't work out or turned out to be less interesting to me. So in a way, through negative selections, I then ended up back where I had started because I realized that actually this is quite a good area to work in for me. I don't think it was very difficult to get into the industry because this internship, I think, was quite accessible. But then you do realize eventually that it is quite a competitive sector in terms of it's becoming a crowded field because more and more consulting firms are entering the public sector advisory services. So in a way, it's not so easy for all businesses to thrive. The good side of this is, of course, with more consultancies entering the business, you will also have more job opportunities eventually. However, you have to be a bit flexible if you really want to make the most of it in terms of where you're based, because these companies are quite spread out across Europe, and not in every city you will find equal opportunities. And I think the same goes for the international level outside of Europe. Not particularly important unless you consider attending or visiting an internship fair. I think that's also networking, right? So in a sense, that helped. And then I think networking with alumni from a university didn't necessarily help directly, but it helps in general to understand or to have these connections, to understand what other people are doing. It also helps even within your organization to network. So we are a company with 12 or 13 different offices in 12 different countries. And if it makes sense to at least have one contact in each of these offices, someone you've met personally, and you can also, the networking doesn't stop once you have a job. It actually remains just as important. I had a few internships that I'd done before I picked up this first job, but actually the first job started out as an internship. So in a way, I think definitely it's useful to have work experience, to have tried out a few different things. It's always useful if you have some experience already working for or in the public sector before you end up consulting for the public sector. Or you could work in industry in the private sector, because these skills are also useful in companies that consult for the public sector. So yes, I think it's useful. I would say, in general, at least in the context that I'm familiar with, for students, yeah, try to get an internship while you're studying. So before you actually have to determine your path for after you graduate, try to gain as much as possible international experience. I think that's a no-brainer nowadays in most industries, but it certainly is very relevant in my industry. It makes sense, but otherwise you would probably not be interested in this topic or this sector, to follow politics quite closely, not necessarily because what's going on a daily basis is always that relevant to your work, but I think it just helps you to understand in principle how political dynamics work, what are the main policy issues of currently that are being debated. So I think that's always useful.